Hi learners, you're welcome to our 13th lesson in science, and I hope you're doing well. Today we are continuing our lesson on the light energy, and you are expected by the end of the lesson to be able to state the laws of reflection. State the laws of reflection. B. Calculate angle of incidence of a given reflection. Calculate angle of incidence for given reflection. In our previous lesson, we began with the study of reflection. We identified the meaning of reflection. Then we demonstrated how reflection of light takes place. Then we ended our lesson on the ray diagram of reflection. On the diagram, we identified incident ray, normal, reflected ray, and then a reflecting surface. We also identified the angle of incidence between the normal and then the incident ray, and then the angle of reflection between the normal and then the reflected ray. We're cautioned to be careful with the arrows, to put the arrows on the diagram, and arrows are not placed on a normal. So that's how we discuss the previous lesson. Now, can you state the laws of reflection? Now, let's look at the diagram once more. Now, as you can see in the diagram, we have the reflecting surface. Now, I would like to say something about the reflecting surface, which is usually a mirror, a plane mirror. Now, looking at this diagram carefully, you realize that the reflecting surface is marked with dashes, slanted like this. I will caution that try as much as possible that anytime you draw the ray diagram, show these dashed lines below the reflecting surface. You may say, what does it mean? The mirror, if you look at the mirror carefully, it consists of a transparent glass with a coated silver surface below it. In a mirror you see. Now, the image is actually formed in the silver line behind the glass. And the diagram to show the silver coating is a shaded portion, which is what we are seeing on the screen. So do your best not only to draw a line, but to show the dashes below it anytime you are drawing a reflecting surface. This is an addition to the explanation I offered to the ray diagram in the previous lesson. So let's take note. So what are the laws of reflection of light? What are the laws of reflection of light? We have two laws of reflection. Now let's take the first one. The first one states that the incident ray, the reflected ray, and the normal all lie in the same plane. The incident ray, the reflected ray, and the normal all lie in the same plane. In other words, they are all on one side of the plane mirror. We don't have anything here. So they all lie in the same plane. Now there's a bit of cutting in the letters here. It's an error. The image has covered part of the letters. So remember this D, T, H, E, then lie, L-I-E. Okay. Now let's look at the second law of reflection. What is the second law of reflection? The second law is very easy. It states that the angle of incidence, which is the small I here, is the same as the angle of reflection, the small r. Or in short, small I is equal to small r. That's the second law. So we'll be able to state the laws with ease. And now let's move on to look at how to calculate the angle of reflection in a word problem. How to calculate the angle of incidence, this one, I, and then find the angle of reflection. So let's look at a work example. Let's read. A ray of light strikes the surface of a plane mirror at an angle of 35 degrees. A ray of light strikes the surface of a plane mirror at an angle of 35 degrees. Question 1. Draw a ray diagram to represent the reflection. Draw a ray diagram to represent the reflection. Question 2. Calculate the angle of incidence. Calculate the angle of incidence. Then the last question. What is the angle of reflection? What is the angle of reflection? Now, this is a typical DSE question, and it must be approached carefully. Now, let's look at the answers. Now, for A, we are asked to draw a ray diagram. But in this case, we must show 35 degrees on the diagram. So let's see how this can be done. All right. So again, you draw a ray diagram, label the part, put your letters for I for angle of incidence, small r for angle of reflection. But remember, we are told that a ray of light strikes the surface at an angle of 35 degrees. 35 degrees, as you can see here. At an angle of 35 degrees. Now, I didn't place the 35 here, but I place it so that it will be in between the ray of light and then the surface it strikes. So take note of that. It should be placed between the incidence ray and the reflecting surface or the mirror. Now let's see how to calculate the angle of incidence. That's a big question. So we still have the diagram here. Now, to calculate the angle of incidence, let us take note of this fact. In our previous lesson, I said the normal, which is an imaginary line drawn separating the incident ray from the reflected ray, is always at right angle with the reflecting surface. In other words, the angle between the normal and the plane mirror is 90 degrees, right angle. So in order to calculate the angle of incidence, we must write an equation connecting I, which is the angle of incidence, 35 degrees, and then the 90 degrees. And how do you write the equation correctly? Very good. When you add I to the 35 degrees, the result should be equal to 90 degrees. Agree? Let's check on the diagram. I start from here and ends here. 35 start from the same place and end here. When you combine all of these, they will add up to 90 degrees. 90 degrees. So we have written the equation. It is this equation that will help us get the I, the angle of incidence. All right? Now we've learned in mathematics how to calculate the value for a variable in a simple linear equation. So we're using the same idea here. Now, in order to allow I to stand alone, this 35 must be, taken out from this side or from the side of the equal sign. And how do we do that? Some will say, yes, the 35 will cross the equal sign and can be. But mathematically, we don't say it crossed the equal sign. Rather, we are going to do some operation on the 35 and allow it to disappear. Now, before we do that, what is 35 doing to the I? Good, it is adding. And if it is adding, how do we get rid of something that is adding? Good, we have to subtract 35 from itself. Now, in linear equation, remember the left-hand side is equal to the right-hand side. And whatsoever you do to the left-hand side, the same is done to the right-hand side. So if you are subtracting 35 from this side, we should do the same thing to the right-hand side to make it balance. Okay, so let's see the result of that. Very good. So you can see we have I plus 35 degrees minus 35 degrees. So this is the operation we are doing, this is the action. And the same action is carried here, minus 35 here. Now what will be the result? Very good. The result is that here will become 0, and 0 added to I will be I. So you can see only I remains there. And 35 degrees taken from 90 degrees will give you 55 degrees. Now dear learners, by these principles, we have been able to successfully calculate the angle of incidence, as you can see. Alright, now let's go to the next question. We are supposed to find the angle of reflection. Now in the diagram we have angle of reflection here, which is a small I, R. Now, before you answer this, there's no need to calculate. Before you answer, we say according to the second law of reflection. And before I continue, what says the second law of reflection? Very good. It states that the angle of reflection, I, is equal to the angle of incidence, I, is equal to the angle of reflection. So in short, we have small I is equal to R. So according to this second law, the angle of incidence, as you can see at the top here, should be the same as the angle of reflection. So we just write the answer 55 degrees, as you can see. So let's see, we don't calculate it, we just quote the law and then translate the angle of incidence as an answer for the angle of reflection. My dear learners, we have come to an end of this interesting lesson. Today we touched on the laws of reflection of light. The first law states that the incident ray, the reflected ray, and the normal all lie in the same plane. 2. The angle of incidence is the same as the angle of reflection. The angle of incidence is the same as the angle of reflection. All right. Make sure you do the exercise and submit the exercise in time. All right, till we meet again. Stay safe.